at the beginning, the first systemic properties were mechanical, in a sense, were the notion of a machine as a holistic unit. But there's a big difference, and that is usually a machine can be brought to its knees, bad metaphor, with one part that gets damaged. Whereas somehow these complex dynamical systems that emerge in the universe, whether it's physical, Bernard cells, chemical, BZ reactions, or living organism structures, they tend to degrade more gracefully than a machine. They kind of go out of kilter for a while, but there's a persistence that allows this hanging together relationship, allows them to persist.
Alicia Juarrero, thank you very much for joining me today to discuss your latest book, Context Changes Everything. We'll probably mention Dynamics in Action as well, which is like a huge book, really, for intentionality and a massive,
Thank you so much.
a massive work. And so, I suppose to start off with, the framing of In Context Changes Everything, you have a bit called the backstory, which is kind of spelling out, what's gone wrong. What is it? This worldview, I had written down a load of things, materialism, nominalism, reductionism, efficient causality, causal closure, determinism, no free will. It's this huge thing. So I wondered, could you tell us a bit about how you see that backstory, what went wrong, and maybe we'll go through it kind of bit by bit for the first while.
I think it boils down to two issues. The refusal to allow context and the role of context in our intentions, our behavior, our identities, so it's the dismissal of context from philosophy. And I think the reason that happens is twofold. One is, I think it happens because very early on, whether it's Aristotelian substances or Cartesian, the notion that essential properties that are internal to a stuff thing, so there's that part of it too. We tend to reify everything, and we have forever. I always joke around and say that's because Parmenides won and Heraclitus lost way back when, right? If we thought in terms of process, we might not do that. But because we think of properties as exclusively internal, that also means that all the causal relationships, the heavy lifting, I borrowed that phrase from somebody and I can't remember. The heavy lifting, maybe Wim's, heavy lifting is always done from the bottom up, from the essential particulate properties, and of course, whether they were atoms and now they are subatomic particles or whatever the foundational, fundamental, tiny little minuscule, invisible things are, then everything should issue from the bottom up, causal wise. But that means that therefore you cannot have what I call coherent wholes. That's the backstory for that. Because if all the causal lifting is bottom up, the implication there is that there is no top down from whole to part causes. Why? Because wholes are nothing but aggregates. If all is particulate at the bottom level, then anything that seems like a coordination, like a synchrony, like a coherent holism must be illusory, must be our way of organizing the world, but it's not really real. So
epiphenomenal.
Epiphenomenal, to use the technical term, it's causally powerless, correct. And I think part of that, well, in the backstory in both books, I mentioned Kant, when he's looking at purposiveness, he realized that there's something about parts and wholes looping down to act on parts. And he uses the example in the Critique of Practical Reason. He says, it's very curious that the tree as a whole, and that's what he means, produces the leaves, but the tree itself is in turn produced by the leaves. But then Kant says that is a form of causality unknown to us. Meaning what? Remember, Kant gets awakened from his dogmatic slumbers by Hume. Hume believes in linear mechanistic causes. So the notion of recursion in general, circular or spiral or whatever you want to call it, causality, simply cannot be allowed. And I think that goes hand in hand with the elimination of context. Because I think if you think of a whole as other than, a separate from its parts, that's the only way you can understand efficient causality, Aristotelian efficient causality, which is what we had left with after the Newtonian science dismissed formal and final cause. And people think I want to bring back formal and final cause, well, but not in an Aristotelian sense, not in a Catholic Church sense. I want to rethink it in a contemporary science sense. So as soon as you have the inability to loop back down and feedback and Bayesian reasoning in the epistemology and feedback in neural networks and so on, then you have no way to understand a whole that is different from but not other than the parts that made it whole. And my best example there is homeostasis. What is homeostasis? Homeostasis is a holistic property of an organism. No one cell is homeostatic. Homeostasis is the property of a systemic, coherent, synchronized, coordinated whole. But coordination, synchrony, and holism, as I am using it, are systemic properties. They are collective properties. They are not properties of individuals. So I think all of the backstory backs up to that. And I was mentioning that I'm writing something now, and it would have been too long because the French have a term that l'esprit de l'escalier, which means, after somebody insults you at a dinner party, and then as you're going down the stairs, you go, oh, I should have said this. I should have retorted in this way. And it's sort of an esprit de l'escalier chapter, but it's too long. And in a sense, I think there's so much about positivism and our inheritance of positivism. That was a whole section in the backstory that I left out, sort of the 20th century. And so you get why sense datum theory in positivism and verificationism. Why? Because everything has to be particulate. Not only the ontology has to be particulate, but therefore our epistemology has to only work in a particulate, the smallest gauge possible. And so anyway, I can go on with that forever because it seems to me that in America, existentialism, phenomenology, Bergson emergentism, Freud, Marx, all of these people were relegated to literature departments, psychology departments, sociology departments. God forbid they should be allowed into Anglo-American philosophy departments. And it's the same problem. It's the same problem. So we have to have some kind of respectable science base. And the reason I say respectable is because the last attempt at this ended up with dualism in a sense. And in dualism, then how does the mind, which is supposed to be an entirely separate and distinct substance, because of course you need two entities with their own essential traits, correct? How does this one, which is outside of the realm of physicality, insert itself into the physical so that my arm rises when I intend to raise my arm without violating closer? You're bringing in, that violates conservation of matter and energy. You're bringing in something from outside. You can't do that. So it doesn't work. But that's because we had no understanding of what wholes could be. If I can keep going, when I first read Order Out of Chaos by Ilya Prigogine and the whole notion of dissipative structures, I happened to be reading it on the same day. It's a long story. I was at jury duty. I was bored. I had nothing to do. I took a whole bunch of books I had to read. I wanted to read. And I read Kant's Critique of Practical Reason, where he says, look, this is a form of causality unknown to us. And here's Prigogine talking about Bénard cells and BZ reactions, which are exactly the same kind of looping, recursive processes that allow wholes to emerge, to self-organize, and loop back down and control their component parts as wholes. We're going, that's it, that did it. That did it. And that's what precipitated dynamics in action. But that one was focused mainly on intentional causation. What I wanted to do was to think more broadly in this one and think about, well, how does that apply more broadly than just intentional causation? So, sorry, I'm long-winded. You should just interrupt me.
No, I mean, you've touched on most of the main points there in terms of this kind of circular causality being excluded from the efficient causality paradigm. It's interesting that you don't root that specifically in Newton, because it kind of seems like that it goes back even further in terms of Western philosophy at this idea of primary properties as internal properties that then kind of leads to this later. I don't. Might be a bit of a tangent, but I don't know if you know the work of Ian McGilchrist.
Yes, I do.
The Master and His Emissary.
I do. I've got it here someplace.
Yeah, I spoke to Ian before, and he makes kind of a point about this particular kind of materialist worldview, where he argues for different epistemologies for the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, basically. One that's more a type of attention that's very particular focused, and another that's focused on the wider picture. And this particular one really seems to be very much within that tradition. It's like a very much a narrowing down of reality to whatever is at the bottom of it, this kind of, dead dirt matter, and that's the really real thing. But that seems to ignore our own role in seeing that, understanding it, comprehending it. Can't explain the entire of our own consciousness. I wonder if those ideas are, I mean, how do you see epistemology in that?
I would like for epistemology to piggyback on ontology, but I think that's the wrong way around since Kant. People tend to think of it the other way around, right? You think conditions of possibility of cognition and so on, then let's see what that suggests about reality. I can afford to say, you know what? I don't care if I've got this wrong. I can play around and what have we thought ontology first? And then hopefully the epistemology would piggyback on it. And in a sense, you have that, as you just implied, suggested with Aristotle, because the reason why Aristotle did not want circular causality was because that would mess up his first cause prime mover.
Yeah.
And that goes all the way through Western. What you need is, all right, so all the causes go back, but then there's got to be at some point where the cause of that is completely other than. But if in fact coherent dynamics can self-organize, then we're talking a whole different game. And that's what I find so fascinating about dissipative structure theory, the whole notion of complexity theory. And I think that sort of goes back to when I was doing my dissertation, again, back in the day. And the idea was, it cannot be that one neuron pushes another neuron, which pushes another neuron. Even if you have the two hemispheres, it can't work that way. And at the time, even engineering and operations research were talking about network dynamics, network theory, systems dynamics. There's got to be somehow these neurons have to organize into a system, meaning a network type property that has emergent properties. Right? And so once you allow that the network has emergent properties, which if you have read, do you know the work of Carl Gillette? Carl Gillette suggests that even the physicists has finally grudgingly allowed that, for example, superfluidity, superconductivity, that they have properties that the component parts don't have. But Carl Gillette, and that book of his is 2016, I think, he says even the physicists are reluctant to this day to allow that the dynamic as a whole can affect the components. But I think complex dynamical systems theory gives you a way of understanding that kind of top-down causality of the homeostasis as a systemic emergent property, if you will, in my view, does sort of set the parameters of, all right, this is the range of viability and health of an organism. If you're right in the middle, you're probably the healthiest or thereabouts. If you start hitting the edges, then you're hitting the edges of your adaptive range of, but that parameter becomes a normative thing. Homeostasis, in a sense, sets the normative conditions of what health is. I mean, you can't find health in a variable, in one organ. Health is this parametric possibility space that if you're within this subset of all the ranges of each of the organs and each of the connections and so on, then you are a healthy person. If you start, you can bear a little bit. So I like it because it gives me, in a sense, we start focusing more on waves rather than particles, right?
And do you think you focus more on biology than physics? Like if you start off with the physics and then go the other way, that's where you end up with. But now this is kind of going back.
And you cannot blame every science. Every science wanted to be physics. Economics, sociology, psychology, everybody was looking for universal, eternal, unchanging laws that you just could plug in the initial conditions and crank out the output as if you were cranking out eclipses. Because after all, we're so little and the universe is so big, and yet we can predict these eclipses so far ahead. Hey, you can't blame
Wasn't that the first philosophical realization as well? Tales or something?
You
first
can't blame people for thinking that way. But even Stephen Hawking suggested, I think, at one point that the 21st century would be the century of complexity, and in a sense, it'd be the century of biology. So the more appropriate metaphor or model, I think, is the biological, and I think it took until we started to understand ecosystems and through flows of energy and matter flows in ecosystems, and how people thought, oh, let's save the I don't know, the coral reefs. Oh yeah, but this one little plankton really doesn't much matter. I mean, that's not that we're saving the coral reef. Yeah, until we realize the coral reef is nothing but so much more than all of these, including so once we started understanding that you can't just say, oh, we can dismiss this one thread in the tapestry. And as soon as we realize that it's the interweaving of these that matters, then, and I think maybe the newer generation, which has been more used to the emphasis on ecology, on this sort of thing and this problem, that it rings more easily to them than it did to others. Do you think
there was more of a mechanistic kind of metaphor going on? This idea of like the universe as a machine, a clockwork universe, the weirdest machines.
Those two just sort of went beautifully together. I mean, in a sense, you get Tycho Brahe and you get Kepler and you get Newton and so on. And so it all worked out beautifully. And I think at the beginning, the first systemic properties were mechanical, in a sense, were the notion of a machine as a holistic unit but there's a big difference, and that is usually a machine can be brought to its knees, bad metaphor, with one part that gets damaged. Whereas somehow these complex dynamical systems that emerge in the universe, whether it's physical Bernard cells chemical busy reactions, human or living organism structures, they tend to degrade more gracefully than a machine. They kind of go out of kilter for a while, and then but there's a persistence that allows this hanging together relationship, allows them to persist in a way that, if you want to add the other science, and that is old classical thermodynamics, that everything was winding down to thermal equilibrium and heat death, cannot fathom. It's curious because classical thermodynamics and Darwin were sort of contemporary, yet
And
Darwin
at odds.
shows an increase in complexification, and classical thermodynamics argues for an inevitable degradation of energy potential into homogeneity, whereas we get increasing heterogeneity as the universe has evolved.
And that's kind of where the agency comes in as well, because it's like when you point out like a machine, like with a lot of the artificial intelligence stuff, it's like, okay, it's great at playing chess or it's great at playing Go, but like if you try and teach it, to draw a picture and do chess, it's no good. Like it doesn't generalize, whereas we're capable of maintaining our self-organization and increasing it across many different domains. Despite the fact our environment changes, we seem to be able to adapt to the environment and to become qualitatively, not entirely different, but certainly to develop, quite rapidly and adaptively. Whereas, dead material things don't really seem to do that.
But you wonder, I absolutely agree. AI, as of today, does not generalize that well. Compared to a 4-year-old, a 3-year-old. But once you add not just text, which is what the LLMs do right now, the large language models is text. Once you add sensory, cameras and speakers and audios and microphones and so on, and all of that gets fed back into a loop, then you wonder what might happen. And in dynamics in action, and even in this one, I mentioned the notion of deep dyslexia and surface dyslexia, and how these machines can make the kind of mistake where they preserve semantic meaning, which to me was unbelievable. And that's Geoffrey Hinton's work from the 80s or thereabouts. It's a long time ago. And notice that Geoffrey Hinton is at the front of AI work, and he was the one who resigned from, was it Google or whoever, because he's concerned and so on. So, I'm not that quick at dismissing AI automatically. But it's going to take a while, and certainly the problem of generalization is an issue that we need to understand.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. The computational model of AI, I think, is very limited by those things. But if it was on a more biological basis, I think they could probably overcome some of them. But I guess just in terms of its comparison to us, I think that trying to create artificial intelligence has made us realize how different we are to just these kind of the computer metaphor of the mind, basically, which seems to result when you apply the worldview that you're talking about to human beings and to our, like it's failed to explain really how we function. Would you say that's fair?
I think that's fair. I think that once we got neural networks and these backprop algorithms, then they're not really programmed. So it's not old-fashioned programming that, here's the lookup table a la Turing, right? And then you plug in the input here and it'll kick out the output there. If you notice, the terminology that tends to be used here is they're trained. And I find that fascinating because I keep going, so what's the difference between that and my parents, right? hits the backdrop accuracy and say, no, you did that wrong. You're this far away from getting it right. And that was the constant. And so sooner or later you start, what happens? You start learning. A human starts learning. What does that mean? I think what that means, and this goes back to Plato's notion of the Meno and everything else, right? What that means is that we start organizing categories in terms of which we organize the world because, grant you, that's the data set we got, correct? I always say when I lived in California, where there are so many Asian people, after 2 or 3 years, I got pretty good at distinguishing between Cambodians and Japanese and Chinese and Vietnamese. I could tell the difference. They did not all look just East Asian. Correct?
Mm.
But once you're back in the East Coast where there are not that many Asian Americans, I notice I've lost that ability to create finer and more precise categories, if you will, right? So we start organizing the world into categories. And at the beginning, famous example, you're teaching a child dog, you go dog and point to a boxer, dog, you point to a chihuahua, dog, you point to that. And then all of a sudden a cat goes by and the kid says dog. Why? Because the category of the kid is simply four legs, little ears like this, and that's a dog. No, that's a cat. Okay, so now they've got to differentiate more precisely, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's what learning consists in. And the advantage of that is that the category you're learning is kind of like homeostasis. What I mean by that is homeostasis as a normative value can be satisfied by a lot of different combinations of, well, if the glucose is a little bit too high here, but well, if you lower this other enzyme on the other side, then it'll balance out. So there are a lot of different, it is what biologists call degenerate. I love that word. A lot of different paths to get to the same emergent output. I was very tempted to call this book In Praise of Degeneracy. Then I thought, no, don't push it. Don't push it. But do you see what I mean? So in a sense, our epistemological categories are degenerate, meaning you've got the notion of dog, and that allows an awful lot of variations within it, to the point where I remember the first time Shar-Peis, those Chinese dogs, were brought into the United States. Nobody had ever seen a dog that looked like that, all wrinkly, but nobody had any problem identifying it as a dog. So how do we do that? We do that because the categories that we organize are the word I use, which I wish I could find. The other word was degenerate. I wasn't going to use that. It's multiply realizable. Correct? There are multiple ways of actualizing the category dog. But that's true for homeostasis. There are multiple ways of realizing the category of homeostasis. There are multiple ways of realizing the category hurricane or tornado. And I always joke with Stan Salty, who's a good dear friend, who's a biologist. And I said, people instinctively realize that there are similarities between hurricanes and people because they named the hurricanes.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is because these complex dynamical systems seem to have the same antecedent conditions, but if they're off by any minuscule amount, they will take oftentimes entirely different trajectories. And in a sense, that's the individuation of a hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And it happens because of the environment, the context it traverses as it goes along. But that's probably true. We become increasingly individuated over time as we grow up and become more ourselves because we acquire these context-dependent characteristics that are unique to that trajectory. And so, in a sense, what I wanted to do in this book is point out how I'm not convinced there's a sharp qualitative leap between the non-living and the living, or the living and the human. I think there are a lot of gradations in between, and which is not to say that at each transition you don't get novel emergent properties. That I absolutely want to maintain. But you get novel emergent properties at the chemical level, which you didn't have at the physical level. You get qualitative emergent properties at the biological level you didn't get at the chemical level. You get qualitatively emergent properties at the human level, which you didn't get even at the chip level. And that's how we make those kinds of distinctions. Where are the qualities that characterize the parameter that we're interested in, the category that, and I think those categories are real. And hopefully we acquire knowledge if we get it right, get the ontology right.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, it's in terms of, like, can we, I heard Vervaeke talk about it before in terms of evolving the meta trait of evolvability.
Yes.
Like,
yes.
Our capacity to,
Yes.
Other animals can evolve, but then we can evolve our capacity to evolve.
Correct. I love William Wimsatt's work on the notion of evolvability, and he talks about it in terms of generative constraints, which I really like a lot, because one thing I tried to do in this book is, well, I started doing that in Dynamics in Action so many years ago, and that is stop using the terminology cause, because I just don't want to battle the physicists. I don't want to battle the scientist who's going to say, as soon as I say, the environment is, no, that's not a cause, of course, because for them, the concept of cause is exclusively energy transfer a la efficient cause. I'm not going to battle that because I'm going to lose that battle. So, all right, so what terminology am I going to use? All right, so how about constraint? Because it does seem to me that mechanical engineers use the term constraint. A lot of them use the word constraint, but it's usually been used to mean a restriction of the possibility space, a contraction of what is possible. But that's not true for the biologist. The biologist from way back when, Howard Patty, Stan Salty, Niels Eldridge, a whole bunch of them talk about enabling constraints, constraints that allow opening for new possibilities to arise. And I think that there are two kinds of enabling constraints, and one is spatial, one is temporal. The temporal example is the example I love, which is the child on the playground swing, which to me is a beautiful example of it ain't all efficient causality. There's more. I'm not discounting efficient causality. I want to say there's something else. The child needs to learn that it's not how hard the child kicks on a playground swing, it's when it kicks. And that timing does not impart energy. And yet, without that timing, the swing won't swing. Correct? And spatial constraints are the same. I ended up using two examples from playgrounds, and that is a teeter-totter, as the Brits say, or seesaw here in the United States, depends on where the child or adult sits, because of weight, because of length of the plank, because of all that. That makes a big difference as to whether it can seesaw well enough. So spatial constraints matter, and in over and above, I don't like to use the word over and above, but in addition to the energy efficiency, right? The push off from the ground that the first child on one end kicks the seesaw into action. And so I think that emergent constraints, and since I started using that term, people have asked me, and I think I didn't explain it correctly enough, because there seems to be a common tendency to say enabling constraint is anything that helps me do something. No, that's not what I mean by enabling constraint. I mean by enabling constraints processes, event that do not impart energy directly, but that contribute to linking independent processes together such that a new whole can emerge. So it's like the weaving of the thread.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I mean by emergent constraint. And I think if you think in those terms, then you start being able to explain what our intentions. Our intentions are new. The technical mathematical terms is dynamical attractor in a complex space. That has emergent properties, and that once you're entrained in that attractor, then you will tend to behave in this way. And the emergent properties of those attractors in the brain are semantic. They can be affective, like or not like, that sort of thing.
Hmm. And because it is that human level intentionality that it's kind of like trying to explain, because that's really excluded, I suppose, from the more materialist model of like counterfactual imaginings. Like I can picture a goal state in my mind, entrain actions towards it, and
Correct.
you know, win a game of football or something. Like
Correct.
that ability to do that is I mean, central to being a human being.
Correct.
It's kind of the thing we you know are trying to foster.
Correct. And what is imagination? And imagination meaning meaningful and so on. And that entrains with coordination of muscle movement. So you've got two entirely different dynamics, one having to do with conceiving of the future, and the other one with entraining muscle movement and neuromuscular positioning and so on to turn that proposed goal into reality, right? And I think that is certainly what we understand as typically human. I am not sure that there's, again, that big a qualitative leap between that and maybe precursors. I'm not saying they're the same, precursors. But I think our interest in ecology and again in nature, so this morning, the newspaper, or is it the newspaper? I think in the latest issue of Science or Nature magazine, we're not talking People magazine, we're talking respectable science magazines, about they think they found that primates name each other, that they have individual names or calls. Obviously, it wouldn't be whatever. The individual calls identify individuals. Now, I don't think we thought they could do that sort of thing. I mean, there are, or the old chimp.
I was just going to say the red dot test in terms of their
red dot test, and
self-consciousness.
now they're saying elephants can do that, and so the question of I would be very surprised if there was a qualitative discontinuity. I would suspect that we're going to, but that doesn't mean that there are not qualitative differences at each stage of the game. And of course, we would say that we're the apex. I'm not sure we used to say that. I'm not sure we do that much anymore, because we're certainly not the kindest. We're certainly not most people. We're certainly not the, and so on and so forth. So, but once you start thinking in these terms about how these properties how these dynamics can self-organize, and how emergent properties can, in fact, loop back down and can be explained in a perfectly scientifically explained way by a reconfiguration of the possibility space, a production of a new in a trajectory space, and I think I use it it's the one image I use in both books, and that's Waddington's Creoles, this is Waddington's adaptive landscapes. I think that allows us to imagine what that might look like, and that is that we think of a possibility space, and then it's sort of vague, and then it gets increasingly specified. Yeah, the word specified as in specific and individuated and so on as we go along. And that's probably true phylogenetically. See, one kind of constraint that I think we ignore, and that's due to the Newtonian backstory, and that is temporal constraints. We forget that Prigogine, Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in chemistry in 1977, I guess it was, for these dissipative structures. I had the good fortune to meet him in person several times, including he invited a group of us to his apartment for dinner. That was amazing. And he would say often, and I've never seen it written down, but he said often, these systems carry their history on their, whereas Newtonian science is ahistorical. Individual, independent entities are plunked into space and time, and the equations of Newtonian science can go backwards as well as forwards. Whereas for Prigogine, it's really important to understand that, and that's why he kind of liked Whitehead, the notion of prehensions and stuff. But the idea that you carry your history on your back, and so that doesn't mean you're determined by the past. Doesn't mean that your genetics it's always open, but it does influence the possibility space. And I think we all intuitively appreciate that.
And it's like that it constrains the affordances that we can see in the landscape, like our personality, our history, our culture, it constantly, that's like the world that we live in, which has struck me more and more, is that there's a sense that, because a lot of what I'm working on obviously is the internet and social media and these things that are creating new constraints and new norms. I mean, a lot of the problems with them is that it's completely unconstrained. It's just released this kind of new world with very little constraints in it. And then people are learning norms from there and then applying them in the real world, which is creating a lot of chaos. But this kind of constraint, I wanted to, I suppose, to move a little bit towards ethics and culture, is because you describe ethics as being about constraints, values being about constraints. Like, what are the proper
about enabling as well as restrictive constraints? I don't think. One example somebody gave me once was, in a sense, the rules of the sonnet are very strict, but the rules of the sonnet allow us to create a beautiful form of poetry that was not possible before. So I think there are certain rules that open up possibilities. Yeah. There are certain rules that entrench the old status quo and do not allow for change, and they are restrictive and so on. Those, to me, are the top-down governing constraints. Now, the top-down governing constraints are necessary because you need stability. So if you allow enabling constraints to encourage and afford new possibilities to open up, that you want those new possibilities to achieve some level of stability so you don't get lost. So you need some kind of ratcheting system that you don't go back down all the way down. That's why the notion of scaffolding, I think, has become popular, because a scaffold, in a sense, is a point of stability that allows the thing to stay stable for a while until the next move happens. So you need that. I mean, and I would assume that social organization is one enabling constraint like that, correct? If you didn't have a social group, maybe the minimal, a family, that sort of thing, you can't there are a lot of things you can't achieve on your own. So you need the collective dynamic with its emergent properties to allow the individual to flourish and have their potentiality be developed more within that social organization than otherwise. You cannot be a citizen. You cannot be a teacher. You cannot be a without a social organization. That those require social organizations before those features of a human person can occur, can even happen. They are conditions of possibility. But what you want to do, and this kind of ties in with our generative notion of evolvability, you want to make sure those top-down emergent constraints that then stabilize and become constitutive or governing constraints are flexible enough to be responsive to the context. If they're not, if they're so rigid that they are totally irresponsive, they are, in a sense, they are not fit for purpose, because they're not. So it's a very tricky metastability. It's not the stability of all-time thermodynamics, where stability is, think of a ball on the bottom of a cup, right? It just sits there because that's it, nowhere to go, and it does nothing from there on in. Once it might roll around at the beginning when you throw it, but sooner or later it settles down to the bottom of the cup and it stays there. That's old classical thermodynamic stability in thermal equilibrium. That's it. Okay? That is not what nature does. What nature does is it achieves this level of metastability. That's what homeostasis is. That's what a healthy ecosystem is, right? An unhealthy ecosystem is where it's lost, where the constitutive constraints, the enabling constraints, the constitutive constraints, the governing constraints of an ecosystem have lost their hold on the dynamics. And the thing starts teeter-tottering till it finally disintegrates, unless it works. But on the other hand, and we see that most of all in social organizations or in families, where the entrenched constraints are so strong that they become brittle, they become maladaptive, they become not fit for purpose. And so then the value they had, I think, gets lost. And standard value systems have learned how to modify them so that they continue being fit for purpose. If you are in an Abrahamic tradition and you believe thou shalt not kill, all right. But very quickly we say, well, thou shalt not kill except in self-defense. So we start finding exceptions to those rules that allow them to be more flexible and more fit for purpose. Nobody's saying, see, what people tend to say is, you're opening up the door to subjectivity and the slippery slope to relativism. And my answer to that is what Aristotle, I think, once answered when, I remember he was a biologist and so on, and there are treatises where he talks about medical education and so on. I'm not suggesting we go back to classical Greek medicine. But here's the point. Does that mean people shouldn't go to medical school? Of course not. You learn the principles, and the principles are true, and the principles hold. But the difference between a good doctor and a hack is the one who, when he then sees the patient, cannot adapt those principles to this particular circumstance and see. But and when I used to teach this in class, the only way I could do this was go like this. You get a feel for it. Mm-hmm. That interface between the principle and the practice, I'm not sure that can be taught. I'm not sure that can be algorithmized, or whatever the term is. And in that sense, the point you were making earlier about the AI might not generalize, might not that's an open question for me. But that interface between the principle and how am I going to implement it here?
Context.
Exactly. Context. And so Aristotle's answer was very good in that regard. He had theoria, but he also had praxis. And he didn't think that there were three areas in life that he thought theoria, but it's missing something. And one was medicine, one was law, and one was ethics. In all three of those cases, you need to add the context. And therefore, instead of ending up having theoria, you end up having phronesis. That's the argument for phronesis, for wisdom. Wisdom being the ability to take the principle and apply it to these conditions at this moment. And that's why, in a sense, he thought ethics could only be taught almost as an apprenticeship, the way you would medicine, the way you would law, because that's what the shoemaker, the cobbler's child learned. That's what the way the ironmonger's child learned. And what they learned was, after years of seeing the particular, you would see a lot of the exceptions that, and then the mentor, the teacher would say, no, in this condition, we don't do that, we do this. Or maybe the mentor couldn't even articulate that, but the mentor would do it differently, and then the apprentice would see the difference and how in these cases that's what would happen. And so, and clearly our attempt to teach ethics through Chekhov decalogues or Kant's categorical imperative doesn't seem to take very well. It's kind of a do as the rule says, not as I do. That doesn't seem to be very effective.
And it's an argument for that Aristotelian virtue ethics tradition, which is like the deontological aspect of it really seems to be very like almost like natural laws, like that there's moral laws that you can just apply infinitely in any circumstance. Like Kant's categorical imperative is that, and obviously the famous example of Adolf Eichmann, who said he was following Kant's categorical imperative, kind of backfired on that. But so with the virtue ethics, I mean, because context matters there, conditions matter, how you apply it. They're like skills, perspectives, character traits. Like it's a type of person that you need to become in order to be ethical, in a sense, a virtuous character.
And then I think Martha Nussbaum takes it one step further when she looks at the capabilities approach, when she says, look, and there are structural conditions that either afford the possibility of human flourishing for everybody, or they restrict the possibility of flourishing for everybody. And so it's not as if we're tabula rasa and we become people on our own. It's that maybe the structural conditions may be such that this is what I call the context independent constraints, and that is they operate as sort of background conditions that are so taken for granted we don't even realize that they are either affording or entrenching and restricting, because they're so accepted, they're so commonplace that you don't ever notice it. And I think that's why, in a sense, port cities historically have been the most innovative cities on ports, because invariably the port meant they would get visitors from the other side of the globe, and all of a sudden they would see something different, or a different way of looking at the world, or a different way of eating, or a different way of behaving in certain ways. And it foregrounded what is normally left in the background. And I think that helps a lot. And so, in a sense, those are enabling constraints. The fact that you're in a port means you have an enabling constraint that these are the sorts of people you're going to run into.
And it's on that, because there's a new, well, it's not new, 2013, Flaherty wrote a paper called infraethics, this idea that infrastructure, that the new ethics or the ethics we need for this attentional age is about the infrastructure, the invisible attentional infrastructure, which really are these enabling constraints that you're talking about and the affordances that they offer and
correct
don't offer.
or don't offer correctly. And
Mm.
they're so in the background that people don't realize them. That, and I think that was probably started by the deconstructionists, sort of foregrounding the margins in the background, that kind of thing. And again,
It's
that's
quite a
another.
Marxist kind of thing as
Yeah,
well. I'm not a huge fan of that, but it
no,
does seem to have some
I'm
in a
not.
negative way.
Yeah, I'm not either. But it suddenly occurred to me as I say, I'm writing this other added backstory, and that is what all of these had in common: phenomenology, existentialism, Marxism, Freudian psychology, deconstruct. All of them somehow tried to bring context back in
Yeah.
one way or the other, or one misguided way or not, but they all were trying to bring context back into the picture. And certainly Anglo-American philosophy stopped that cold. This is not the way we do things at Oxford and Cambridge and so on. This is not the tradition of positivism. This is not science-informed philosophy, which is what we're aiming towards. And it just stopped it cold. For a while there, I thought it was Anglo-American prejudice against the continent in Europe. But
Interesting.
no, I've come to the conclusion it was Anglo-American prejudice against context.
Mm.
That's the real threat. And the problem is it's messy. See, the
Yeah.
nice thing about Newtonian science is it's so neat, right? I think that's also the appeal of Platonic forms. It's so neat and tidy and perfect and set. It's perfect. Whereas complex dynamical systems are messy. Once you bring in context, you bring in locale, you bring in place instead of space, or you bring in place in addition to space. And, a family dynamic is a unique place that has nothing to do with the physical space that might be around it. So it's messy. And that means there's no clean algorithmic look up table that will give you, tell me what I should do. If this is the situation, this is what I should do. That's what we all tend to want to do. I think that's why when things get messy, there's always politically the call for law and order.
Yeah.
But the question then is what kind of order? Like shutting the whole thing down and freezing the whole thing? Well, that doesn't solve anything. That's not
Yeah.
the way that nature does it. And nature reorganizes and brings in more of what used to be externalities into the system and creates a larger coherent whole, which is kind of one thing I like about this idea. It's as if Spinoza's conatus. I'm getting into trouble by thinking this. I'm not convinced about, but I hope this is the case. Spinoza's conatus is a sort of a tendency of the universe to create even more comprehensive dynamic wholes. But those dynamic wholes are not block universes. They are not rigid monoliths. They are articulated, internally differentiated dynamics that allow for the integrity of each one of those components while at the same time achieving a greater whole, a greater dynamic. I like that. I like the way that. I hope that that's correct. Not
Greater levels of complexity, and it does seem to come down. It's like, is the universe complicated or just complex? Like,
it's
if we can
definitely
algorithmically do the whole thing, great. But it doesn't seem like that's the world we live in, or that's the kind of
no.
creatures we are.
Complicated is in principle might be easy. You look at it. I gave a talk. I enjoyed it a lot near Houston in Texas. I've never been there. And the fields of those oil fields, how does anybody keep track of what flow is going through which pipe and so on? It is so unbelievably complicated. but that's not complex in the way that a little scum of pond in your backyard has a lot more interdependencies that change the components. See, the components of those pipes in the Houston oil field don't widen their diameter of the pipe or narrow it down or reconnect to something else. The way our brain, you lose your hearing, and all of a sudden that auditory part of the brain gets filtered in by another modality, maybe sight. I can't remember which gets connected to it.
Exactly. You're
adapted. A machine does not do that. Whereas that seems to be sort of a tendency to preserve coherence and to find coherence even when there's something that isn't quite right, to try to make it. That's why when people talk about, these AI systems confabulate and they hallucinate, do you remember Gazzaniga's work on the split brain? That's exactly what those split brain patients were doing. They were coming up with stories to try to make sense of the two totally disparate inputs that they were not being able to coordinate in their own brain. That's very similar, it seems to me. We have a tendency to synchronize, to coordinate, it's that sort. In fact, if we believe that matter and energy are interconvertible, then in a sense a molecule is nothing other than coordinated, synchronized atoms. And the covalent.
Do you think the problem is the substance ontology then? Like, do we need a Heraclitus? Like, if we just get rid of nouns, we'll actually be better.
Well, poor David
the
Bohm
world.
tried that. Remember, poor David Bohm, the Nobel Prize winner, tried to, what did he call it? The real mode. I can't remember what he called it. He said, what if we made our language be based on the verbs instead of the nouns, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think ecosystemic thinking helps a lot because we are now focusing on process and on the constraints on those processes that enable them to cohere and the ones that destabilize, that break apart, and so on. So maybe just if we focused on process, and then that would mean that what we used to think of as substance are merely like the intersecting nodes of two processes. Those intersections are what we used to think of as a thing, but they're really just intersections of dynamic processes. And if we started thinking that way, but it's not easy.
No, and that's, I think, again, when I was saying I have sympathy for you trying to articulate these things, like it's such a non-intuitive way to think when we've been trained for so long to look at the world in a particular way. That is simplistic in a sense. It's very easy to just, box things up and one thing hits another thing, and that's, how it all works.
It's so clean, it's so neat, it looks so nice, but it isn't, because a lot gets left out. That's the problem. It's a very filtered view of the world that leaves an awful lot of the mess out, but the mess is awfully important for
an image, really.
Exactly.
A reduction of, and you said kind of at the end of the book, you said that it was about clearing a way, or clearing out a path for something new. Like, do you see what's going to fill that clearing? Do you see it happening in maybe academia or in culture? Do you think that
again, I keep harping on the same thing, but I really think that ecology might be a way of clearing a path for even individuals to understand that they have a role and a part in this, in the health and the future of this planet. And that, because again, these are not block systems. These are not block universes that are rigid and are top-down determined from the top down. The component can change the quality of the overall dynamic, and the overall dynamic, depending on that quality, will affect the possibilities of the components. So it's a two-way street. And I think if we realize that, I remember when ecosystemic thinking started, there was almost at times in some people, almost a quasi-religious feel for this is something that we have an obligation to contribute to that's bigger than ourselves, that we will leave to the next generation, that kind of thing. And so if by thinking in terms of enabling as well as constitutive and governing constraints, as well as efficient causes, that we bring those in, if that opens up more of a clearing, it seems to me that it's worth just trying that way of looking at things.
Yeah, and even the therapeutic angle, to be
Oh,
honest, as a young person,
absolutely.
I suppose, who grew up in a world where it's like there's a lot of chaos and volatility, and having the ability to, take action and to have this conception of self that's not epiphenomenal, really seems key.
Absolutely. The fact that a small fluctuation or perturbation can get amplified by the overall dynamic if it's at the right place and the right time to really cause a huge change. I live in the United States, and I look in the last few weeks at this change in the social attitude of the country. I mean, how does that happen? How does this one small change that you think everybody knew the vice president from before, that you wouldn't have thought that? How does that? It's the right place at the right time with people, and it can make a difference. A small change of an individual can make a huge difference. At the right time, at the right place. Of course, there are times when people come up and it's not the right time, it's not the right place, and the voice gets lost in the cacophony. But there are times when it can get amplified and make a huge difference.
Yeah, and it's an argument for taking it seriously.
Absolutely.
We don't know what's going to be the big thing and what's not going to be.
Absolutely. Well, at least I used to tell my students, if you don't vote, at least don't complain. You've lost your right to complain if you didn't vote. Right? I don't care what else happens. Don't ever complain if you didn't. So,
yep. Well, thank you so much, Alicia.
Oh,
and I'll
so
include
much.
the links to all your work.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
I really encourage people to read and start grappling with these ideas, because I think you're right. It is a clearing for future science that includes the stuff that was left out.
Yeah.
Previously.
Thank you so
very
much.